representing New South Wales ACT. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am presenting. For me, it is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that we're all meeting from across Australia on traditional lands of other people in Australia. Really delighted to be able to have you join us for this piece of work, which is a really important part of the work that we're going to do to change attitudes towards drugs and towards people who use drugs. And we've done a bit of work in this area in Victoria. We've released the Power of Words, and many of you have worked with us on that particular piece of work. But we wanted to reach deeper and start to think about how we could have conversations more broadly that started to shift attitudes around stigma. And we know in that there are some people who are really well supported, and there are some people who are supportive of our efforts, and there are others who are very opposed to our efforts. And then there are those that sit in the middle, those that we may be able to persuade. So we've talked with Mark Chenery, who is the co-founder and director of Common Cause, who does a lot of work in values-based messaging. And Mark's undertaken quite a comprehensive piece of research with assistance from some of us here over the last 12 months to develop a guide on what messaging might be successful in changing attitudes of people around drugs and the people who use them. So today, Mark is going to do a presentation of that research and the message guide. And some of you will have seen this before because you were interviewed during the process and you participated in workshops, and I extend my thanks to you for your support in making this happen. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with Professor Alison Ritter, Director of Drug Policy Modelling Program at the University of New South Wales, Emma Maiden, Head of Advocacy at Uniting New South Wales ACT, Sione Crawford, the CEO of Harm Reduction Victoria, and Ross Bell, the Executive Director of the New Zealand Drug Foundation. And they'll give their views on why this work is so important, how they might have been using it since we've started to do it, and how they see it being used going forward, because one of the challenges we want to sort of talk about and overcome is how we seek to change our behaviour to adopt what we know from Mark's research will be successful messaging around this. So there'll be a panel discussion of about 40 minutes. I really encourage you, if you have questions, to post them in the chat bar. That will help us have a Q&A with Mark and the panel members at the end of it, which I'll be doing my best to moderate virtually. So the session's also being recorded, just to let you know we're recording this session. But I'm going to hand over to Mark now. If I could ask everyone please to mute yourselves so that we don't have interruptions as Mark's presenting. Mark, over to you.
Brilliant, thank you, Erin. So good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to present to you the insight that we've developed through our research and to hear from you on what your questions are around it and your reflections on how you might use this in practice. So we commenced this research in quite a different world in 2019. And before I go into telling you about the insights we've developed through the course of the research, I wanted to ask what you see here. I can't actually see the chat, so maybe just ask yourselves, what do you see here? Many of you are probably seeing a duck facing to the left. Some of you will be seeing a rabbit facing to the right. And you will be seeing both. And this is an example of a really concept that informs our approach called biconceptualism. And it's the ability of our brains to perceive the exact same information from multiple different perspectives. And it's really important when it comes to messaging research and advice, because it means that there is no fixed place where most of our audiences are at. And you'll often hear communication experts tell you to meet people where they're at. And there's an element of truth to that. It is important to understand our audiences. But it's also misleading to assume that people are fixed in their opinions. So in everything that we do and in everything that we've done in this particular piece of research, we've been very aware of the fact that most people can see this issue from multiple different perspectives. Now, there's another reason why we don't automatically start where people are at, and that is often where people are at is really unhelpful territory. Often the dominant frame for our issue is not a useful one. And so the last thing that we want to do is actually jump into that dominant frame and talk about our issue from within it. Instead, what we want to do is explore what other ways are there for people to think and talk about this issue, and then to use either research or our intuition to tell which of these are useful to us and which of these are harmful to us, and then only engage those frames and perspectives that are useful to us. And so that's what we did in this research. We started off really by understanding what are the different ways that Australians and to some degree New Zealanders think and talk about this issue. So the guiding brief for us was really, how do we talk about illicit drugs in ways that reduce stigma directed at people who use them? So there's two elements to this. One is, how do we not unintentionally increase stigma in the way that we talk about drugs? But also, how is there other ways of talking about it that actually actively suppress or reduce that stigma that otherwise is all around us? So in terms of the methodology we use, very quickly, there are three phases to our research. The first involves that exploration as to what are the different perspectives that are already out there in Australia for this issue. We conducted 15 advocate interviews, so interviews with people who care deeply about the drug policy reform or reducing stigma for people who use drugs. We also conducted a public discourse analysis, so where we trawled through tens of thousands of words of publicly available discourse on drugs and drug stigma, and then we coded 17,000 of those words to explore the dominant trends in the way that people think about this. From there, we were able to make assumptions as to what is useful to us and what might not be useful to us. And then in the second phase is about testing those assumptions. So we conducted an online nationally representative survey in which we tested a whole bunch of types of messages and statements, as well as audio messages, to explore to what degree they are persuasive to persuadable audiences. And finally, we worked with a number of stakeholders to explore how the research insights could be put into practice. And from there, we developed a message guide, which will be shared with you after today's session. So I want to start by giving a really quick overview of our discourse analysis. And one of the things that really struck me with this particular piece of research is the degree to which the way in which advocates think about this issue is almost planets apart from the way in which many Australians think about drugs, and particularly the way the opposition frames the issue. So the way advocates, and much of this won't be a surprise to you, but I think it's useful to sort of get our minds into this story. The way in which advocates talk about and think about drugs is as psychoactive substances. They are not inherently harmful or addictive either. So they can cause harm, but that's more of an interplay of the user, the drug, the context, and so on. So not inherently harmful. Whereas the way in which the opposition and many Australians think about drugs is giving them a hell of a lot more character. They are evil, they are predators, they are disgusting, and they are dirty, and they are inherently dangerous and addictive. And while advocates think about the legal status of drugs as being quite arbitrary, clearly given the way tobacco and alcohol are legal products, and tobacco kills 1 in 2 of every user when the product is used exactly as intended, yet they are legal. And then there are other drugs that are illegal that are less dangerous than tobacco and alcohol. Clearly, legal status is not based on harm alone. Whereas for most people, and for our opposition certainly, the legality of drugs is based on harms. The reason why some drugs are legal and others are illegal is directly related to the harms they cause, the dangers involved. And while advocates think about humans, it being natural for humans to try to change the way they think, feel, and behave through either use of substances or other techniques, for the opposition, people who are attracted to using drugs are somehow different. They are troubled. You cannot be normal if you are using illicit drugs. And while advocates believe that drugs can cause harm and do cause harm to some people, the majority of people who use drugs do not come to serious harm. And in fact, it's the legal status of drugs that often causes many of the harms that we associate with drug use. Meanwhile, for the opposition, addiction, death, destroyed lives, this is what we can expect from people using drugs. And if you do use drugs, one of these three, if not all three, will befall you pretty soon. Finally, when it comes to stigma, the way advocates think about stigma is as a huge problem because it forces people who use drugs into the shadows, and it hurts particularly those who are already vulnerable due to other factors. While for our opposition, stigma is both deserved in the sense that given the dangers and inherent dangers of drugs, if you take them anyway, then you deserve the harm that comes your way. But it's also useful from the perspective of if we apply stigma to people to use drugs, that's an extra incentive not to use them and therefore not to come to harm's way. So polar opposite stories going on. And what we wanted to do in our research is so I can hear someone not on. Just make sure that you can click on your microphone in your little dialogue box to mute yourself. That would be great. So what we were doing in the research is finding out to what degree do Australians, and particularly persuadable Australians, agree with these stories? To what extent are these stories acceptable, and to what extent are they persuasive? So in our dial test, what we did is we surveyed almost 1,500 Australians, and they were nationally representative of age, state and gender. And we also included an oversampling of healthcare and social assistance workers, around 315 people, so that we could get a sense of how people who are often in really crucial roles interfacing with people who use drugs, how do they think about the issue, and to what extent can we use messages to reduce stigma amongst that group of people? Now, what we always do in our research is break our audiences down into three different groups, into supporters, persuadables, and our opposition. And we do that so that we can understand who is already locked in as supporters, who is already locked into their opposition and very hard to persuade, and then who is it that can be persuaded, and how many are there in Australia who can be persuaded, or to sort of toggle them into a supporter mindset. And what we found in this research is we've got roughly a fifth of the population as supporters, a fifth as the opposition, and around 2/3 who are absolutely persuadable on the topic, although the extent that we can persuade them is, of course, important too. Now, in terms of understanding that persuadable audience a little bit better, we looked at that through various lenses. One is people's use of drugs. So what we found is there's absolutely a correlation with whether people are likely to be an opponent, a supporter or persuader based on their use of drugs in the past. So we've got almost 60% of our supporter base who has used drugs or who reports having used drugs in the past, specifically prohibited drugs. But even so, it's not the only determinant, because we've still got 40% of supporters who claim to have never used drugs. Similarly, when it comes to people's likelihood to use drugs in the future, there's absolutely a correlation between people's intent to use drugs and their likelihood to be supporters or opposition. But again, it's not 100%. So we've got supporters around 47%, so almost half of our supporters who have no intention of using illicit drugs in the future. Now, when it comes to values, that's another core element of our approach to messaging. And we explored two different dimensions. One is the degree to which people are altruistic and self-transcendent in their values orientation, and the degree to which they are self-enhancement or more individualistic and selfish in their values orientation. And while there is a correlation here, it's not as big as some others. But we do have about twice the amount of our opposition who subscribes to more self-enhancement, sort of ambition, success, power, wealth-orientated values, who are in our opposition compared to our supporter base. But this is the really interesting one. So when it comes to values, there is a huge difference between our supporters and our opposition, as well as our persuadable sitting in the middle, on the question of whether their values orient towards conservative values versus openness to change values. So perhaps unsurprisingly, our supporters are significantly more open to change in their values orientation to our opponents, who are significantly more conservative. and persuadables sit roughly in between the two groups. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about what this means in practice with one of our tips, but this is really insightful and useful for us to keep in mind. So, based on analysing the full extent of our 20-minute survey, asking a whole range of different types of question formats, including split sample questions in which we ask questions one way to one group and a different way to another to see whether the differences in framing influences people's responses, and then analysing all of those responses by our attitudinal groups, our supporters, then our persuadables, then our opposition, gave us a really rich set of data and insights from the research. And what I'm going to share with you now is not all of the tips that emerged from the research. They're all in the guide. We've got about 11 of them in the guide. Today, I'm just going to share with you 5 of what I see as some of the most important tips. And these are all tips which are around trying to diminish or weaken the opposition story and strengthen our story. And I'd love to say that we uncovered messages that were transformational in terms of shifting Australians more in the direction of our supporters and our advocates and how they think about the issue. We didn't do that, but we absolutely found very promising signs that there are things that we can do, practical things we can do in our messaging to shift people further in our direction and in a quite useful way. And the first of those is not to scare people. So one of the defining characteristics of our opposition is the degree to which they are scared of drugs. They see drugs as inherently harmful, inherently addictive. They characterise them as plain evil. Sorry, have I lost my shared screen? Do that again.
Yes, you have, Mark.
Sorry, I'm back.
It's back.
Excellent. So the degree to which the opposition is scared of drugs, and the degree to which our supporters are nowhere near as scared of drugs. So what we want to do in our messaging is not unintentionally emphasise that fear of drugs that might otherwise occur in people. And so what that looks like is one of the things that we notice is drugs are often framed metaphorically as a crisis or even a pandemic. I'm sure that there's less likely that people will use the pandemic metaphor from this point onwards, but it was quite prominent in the discourse of framing drugs as a disease that is spreading in our community. And that's particularly unhelpful and harmful. So we need to avoid pandering to those types of framing. But even more subtly, when we talk about drug use as the problem, we imply that drugs are inherently harmful, they are inherently addictive, and therefore drug use is the problem. Whereas what we should be doing is talking about, at the very least, talking about drug harms as the problem, or ideally talking about drug stigma as the problem. And we'll get to that a little later. But we need to make sure that we're not further emphasising the threat factor of drugs. Secondly, in terms of why we shouldn't scare people, I'll just show you these results. So this is showing you the mean score for supporters, persuadables and the opposition when it comes to a whole range of different statements about the outcomes of using drugs. And anything above a 3 means that there is net agreement with that statement. And anything above about a 3.5 is quite a strong level of agreement from the public. And the orange line down the middle, the P, is for persuadables. Those are the audiences that we're really paying attention to here. And what you can see is then when we talk about drugs in terms of the scary side of drugs, that absolutely resonates with persuadables, which makes it particularly important that we don't tap into that frame because it is very, very strong in the people who we could possibly persuade. And when we tap into that, it actually toggles that persuadable audience into an opposition mindset who are even more those drugs. Now, secondly, we need to not.
Mark, can I just interrupt? We've got an echo. I'll just remind people to stay on mute.
Great, thank you, Erin. So the other thing we need to not do is tap into the law and order framing. So one of the key, again, defining characteristics of our opposition is their concern for law and order. And so there is a very strong correlation between concern for law and order and holding stigma towards people who use drugs. And so, for example, at the beginning of our survey, before we introduced the topic of drugs at all, we asked people to nominate their top 3 issues that they were concerned about. And for our opponents, law and order was in that top 3, and it wasn't for persuadables or supporters or the public more generally. In addition, any messages that we showed which talked about drugs in terms of criminality or law and order issues or crime appealed very, very strongly to our opposition. So that's a frame that we want to avoid. And the ways in which we do that is, for one, not using reduction in crime as a justification for law and order reform. So we may genuinely believe that changing the way in which we regulate and police the use of drugs might reduce crime, and that may very well be true. But reminding people of that actually toggles them into an opposition mindset and makes them more likely to stigmatise people who use drugs. Similarly, we have a tendency as advocates to constantly bring up the law and order frame when we say things like drugs are a health issue, not a criminal issue. And all that does when we pair the words drugs and criminality together is, over time, that builds that strengthens that as an association in people's mind. This is something in cognitive linguistics known as negation, and it actually is incredibly harmful, because what we're doing is reminding people of the very concept we want them to forget. And so what we need to do, instead of saying drugs are a health issue, not a criminal issue, or we should treat people humanely, not as criminals, is that we're simply reminding them of that unhelpful frame. And so instead of saying drugs are a health issue, not a criminal issue, we simply say drugs are a health issue, full stop. And if you want to elaborate on what you mean by that, do that by all means, but don't go on about criminality and law and crime. So those are a couple of things that we need to stop doing, because they pander to and strengthen, toggle people into an opposition mindset. So I'm going to share with you a few quick things that we should be doing more of. And one is to frame by values. So one of the really interesting things in this research was the degree to which openness to change values, things like creativity, curiosity, choosing your own goals, excitement, variety and choice, actually was supportive for us, was useful to us. And one thing about values, which is based on decades of research from behavioural economists to social psychologists, is that while all of us has certain values, dispositionally, we can also have our values primed or engaged by messaging. So what we should be doing is tapping into the openness to change values that are in our persuadable audiences in order to toggle them into a more supporter mindset. And what that means in practice is talking about drugs and drug stigma in terms of things like honesty and openness, and framing that as the vision that we have. And I'll elaborate on that more in a second. The other thing we need to do more of is frame stigma as the problem, because what our opposition does is frames drug use as the problem. It scares people about drug use, and that then applies to the people who use drugs as well. We feel fear for them, and we want them to go away, just like we want drugs to go away. Whereas if we shift focus away from drug use and people who use drugs over to the people who are stigmatizing others, whether that be prominent people or whether it be journalists or media outlets that use sensationalist coverage of drugs, that actually toggles our persuadable audiences into a more supporter mindset in which they're less likely to apply that stigma. So, for example, when we've provided people with a whole bunch of statements about what approach is right for drugs, what we found is actually huge levels of support and agreement from persuadable audiences for statements that were framed in terms of openness to change values, things like openness and honesty and more information. Even the idea that stopping all use of drugs is actually unrealistic. All of this helped toggle our persuadable audiences away from the opposition and towards us. And finally, in terms of the tips I'm going to share with you today, we need to show people the diversity of people who use drugs, because there is a tendency to stereotype the drug user, to focus on low socioeconomic status, people who are caught up in the criminal justice system, people who are homeless, people with mental health issues. And we often do that in an attempt to build support for things like treatment services or for law and order reform. But by by pandering to that stereotype, by only showing imagery and stories of people who fit the existing stereotype for people who use drugs, we actually fail to challenge the dominant narrative of our opposition. And so we need to show the diversity of people. And in fact, while persuadables are not as persuaded by messaging that talks about the diversity of people who use drugs, they are persuaded, just to a milder degree. And the more that we emphasise the fact that everyone from lawyers, mechanics to office workers use prohibited drugs and lead otherwise normal lives, the stronger that frame will become over time and the more persuasive it will be to people. But at the very least, when doing that, we're not pandering to the existing stereotypes that allow people, that give people license to stigmatise others, because it's very hard to stigmatise people who look like us. It's much easier to stigmatise people who we can see as the other. So what this all looks like in terms of a story structure, at Common Cause we use a vision barrier action story framework typically, which helps us move away from problem-focused messaging and more towards vision-focused messaging, what we want as opposed to what we don't want. And in terms of a story around drug stigma, roughly that looks something like this. In terms of our vision, we focus on the importance of openness and honesty as values in our society. And we also paint a diverse picture of people who use drugs. In terms of the barrier is then stigma and those who peddle stigma as the problem, as opposed to drug use as the problem. And then we point out how secrecy and stigma actually harms people, and we can give people specific examples of what that looks like. And then in terms of the action, that means framing our solutions in terms of a more honest and open approach to drugs. In addition to that, we call for compassion and support for people who want it. Now, one of the tips in our guide is to actually not always frame drugs use as necessarily requiring treatment. So it's important we don't automatically imply that people who use drugs require support and treatment. But when we do talk about that and talk about people who, for example, are experiencing dependence on drugs, it's really important we do so in a way that gives them agency. And we don't imply that it's up for us to decide whether they need help, but it's something that comes from them. So we always talk about people who want help or people who think they need help. The other thing I really want to quickly mention, it's sort of part of the other tips, but I'm going to throw it in here as a bonus extra, is while people and persuadable people in Australia can hold stigmatising attitudes towards people who use drugs, when we invite them to think more compassionately about other people and to think about other people in terms of people we should care for and love and respect and treat with dignity, that absolutely appeals very strongly to those people. So one of the ways that we can confront stigma is to remind people that we should all treat each other with respect, with love and support if we need it. And that's how we sort of lump that together into the action. Now, I'm going to show you an example of what this message might look like in practice. This is one of the dial messages. So this is an audio recorded message, one of 5 that we tested in our research, in which as people were listening to the message, they could dial up and down on their screen to indicate the level of agreement with what they were hearing in that moment. And what we can then do is look at the way in which supporters, persuadables and the opposition react differently to the message. And what we actually want to see is we want to see our supporters, the green line you're going to see in a moment, we want to see our supporters loving the message, because if they love the message, they're more likely to repeat the message to others. We want to see persuadables, the orange line, following a similar trend. So we want to see them moving up when our supporters move up. And we're okay with the opposition not reaching the levels of either, because these are people who are very hard, if not impossible, to convince. Now, this is not a perfect message, but I did think it would be a useful way of showing you what the dial testing actually looks like in practice. So in the actual message guide that we'll share with you afterwards, we've refined this message based on everything that we tested in the survey, as well as the feedback that we saw from this message. So we've improved it further still, but I think it gives you a general sense of what this sort of openness and honesty messaging and framing might look like in practice. So just make sure that your volume is high enough to hear this, but I'll just play this message now and look out for those green supporter lines, orange persuadables and red opposition.
As a community, We should be able to talk openly and honestly about drugs and their impact on our lives. When we treat drugs as taboo, we push people who use them into the shadows and force them to lie and hide that aspect of their lives. This prevents people from accessing the information and support they need. It's time for a more honest conversation about drugs without judgment and fear. That means more facts and less sensationalised media reporting.
So the benchmark that we typically use is the 70% line. If we can get those persuadable people above 70%, we're quite happy. And this absolutely does that, especially towards the end once we start talking about solutions, which is another one of our tips. Now, I just want to point out the blue line here. The blue line is healthcare workers. And what we found in general with that segment of people is that their responses to messaging was rarely very different from the way in which persuadables responded to the message. So in the end, we didn't end up with different recommendations for people working in healthcare or social assistance to the general public. Finally, what we do in every dial test is before people hear those audio recorded messages, we ask them a whole bunch of attitudinal statements about the issue, and then we repeat those statements as soon as they've heard the message to see whether those messages actually shift people's attitudes on the issue. And I'm going to share with you a couple of sort of key metrics that we observed. Overall, the response was quite positive. So we saw a small but definitely significant change in attitudes amongst persuadables for this statement, in which people were invited to either say that people who use drugs, prohibited drugs, should be held accountable for the choices and punished accordingly, or we should do everything we can to support people who use prohibited drugs to stay healthy and well. And they had to choose between those two options. And what we found is that after hearing those messages, after hearing our openness to change messages, persuadable audiences boosted their support by 4%. So we were at 54% of persuadables, and that was boosted to 60% after hearing the messages, which is a positive shift. Similarly, after hearing the messages, we saw persuadables move from 53% support to 60% support for the statement that punishing people who use drugs causes more harm versus it's important to punish those who choose to use drugs. So overall, we have shifted people through our messaging, and we've discovered a lot about the pitfalls that we really want to avoid when we're communicating. So that's a really quick rundown of the messaging, and I see I've gone slightly faster than I needed to, which is always a pleasant surprise, leaving us a bit more time for Q&A. So I'll pass over to Erin.
Thank you, Mark. It's always great to see that data presented, and there is a lot of information shared in that. So I imagine that there are quite a few questions. Before I do open up for questions, and I would encourage you all to post your questions in the chat function, which is the three little lines in the text box up at the top of your bar. Mark, can I just ask you please to stop sharing your screen? I just wanted to go to our panel members, Alison, Emma, Sione and Ross, who've had a bit more familiarity, and just open up the conversation by asking each of you, perhaps if I'm looking at the people I can see on my screen, perhaps starting with you, Alison, just your thoughts on the research and how you've been using it or how you think you might use it in your work.
Sure. Thanks very much, Erin, and thank you, Mark. Can I particularly thank the Australian Drug Foundation for undertaking this work with Mark and Common Cause. I think it's long overdue that we have this kind of guidance around how to talk about drugs and how to be better advocates for drugs. So this is the first time I think we've had the opportunity to have careful data presented to us about what kind of messaging works and what kind of messaging does not work. And I think this now sets a really significant challenge for all of us to do things differently from how we've done them before. And I think the work is incredibly rigorous and compelling. So while there may be people here today who disagree with some of the tips that Mark has presented, I, for one, am incredibly confident that that this is the right approach that we need to take going forward. This is not going to be particularly easy. I think people who advocate for a better response to drugs, we all live in our own little special world, and we're all talking to each other. And it's always the usual suspects, and probably the group that's here, which I think is over 100 people, are all part of this special world that we're in. And we're very used to certain arguments. The war on drugs, it's a health, not a criminal justice issue. And these have been trotted out time and time again. And I think it's fair to say that we have not succeeded and that we have not gained traction for reforms for the people we care about, for people who use drugs without experiencing problems, and for people who use drugs who do experience problems. So I think this lays down the gauntlet for us to stop being in our own special world and to significantly change how we do things. And for me, the most powerful part of this work is the idea that every time we speak about criminal justice, drug use, a pandemic, the risk of infection, we are invoking our opposers' frames of reference. So that language needs to disappear from our vocabulary, basically, because I think, you know, Mark has demonstrated this very powerfully in the data that Common Cause have collected, but people will be familiar with Lakoff's work, Don't Think of an Elephant, and this is not a new idea. This is an age-old point that every time we use the opposer's frame of reference or use a word, we are actually working against the cause that we're trying to support. One more comment, I think, that so we've got a really difficult task in front of us to change our language and to stop doing some things that we have been doing for many, many years. I think the other thing is that it does create a dilemma for us. And in particular, I think the things around the notion of a pandemic or increasing drug use rates and so on. We're very used to needing to convince people that there's a problem. And the reason why we convince people there's a problem is because we want people to take it seriously and we want governments to invest more resources. And so the temptation is to make the problem bigger and bigger in order to encourage more resources or better responses. So our instinct is right and our intention is right, but I think what we're doing when we create the problem bigger is we're buying into the opposer's narrative and we're supporting their fear. And I know there'd been discussions at the time that naloxone was becoming available, and Sione might want to comment on this and others. There was quite some discussion about whether we should talk about overdose or not, or whether naloxone should be advocated for as a routine health intervention and not create the overdose scare problem in the media. And that's certainly what happened in the ACT, and it was very successful, and peer distribution of naloxone proceeded in the absence of the need for us to create a narrative around a disaster or a crisis. I don't know how, you know, looking forward, how we stop ourselves from wanting to make the problem bigger and how we stop ourselves from using crises, which, you know, COVID's a very good example. But I think that's our challenge, that we need to start to think very creatively about how to argue differently and not create a problem in order to then present the solution. Maybe it's just presenting the solution instead. I don't know. There's some initial comments from me. I hope they're helpful.
Thanks, Alison. That's terrific. There's lots of questions coming in. Thank you. I'm just going to get all of our panel to give their preliminary thoughts, and then I'll come to the questions. So, Ross, what are your thoughts on the research that Mark's presented and what it means for the work you do?
Thanks, Erin. I think the research is absolutely brilliant. I've known of Mark's work for a long time. I'm absolutely convinced of the arguments he makes, and I really like the message around attaching our messages to people's values, and I think we miss out on that often. Look, I absolutely agree with everything Alison says, and I think right now in New Zealand we're in the middle of the cannabis referendum campaign. And so everything around the messaging, getting the messages right, messages that work for persuadable voters is absolutely, it's essential for us if we want to win this. And can I tell you how difficult it is to put into practice the type of research and messages that Mark has done? You know, as Alison says, all of us on this call, I think we're our own worst enemies, you know. I think we're as stuck in our ways as governments are wed to prohibition, you know. And so a lot of the messages that we use, you know, the war on drugs is a failure, prohibition doesn't work, that comes naturally to us. And so when it's come to the cannabis campaign, we've at the Drug Foundation put a lot of effort and money into doing message testing to try to come up with those messages that appealed to those persuadable voters and that somehow connected to positive values. And we think we've got some messages, and we're using them as much as we can. And they're more future focused and very positive and focused on compassion, etc. And I think that's working well. But when it comes to doing a media interview, particularly when you're in a situation of, you've got the no voters or the no campaign on one side and the yes campaign on the other, how easy it is to fall into our traditional messaging, which, and to reject the messaging that we've tested and we know that works, how easy it is to try to do fact checking. I know your numbers are wrong and my numbers are right, and let me tell you all of this research I've just read and can cite, and look what they're doing in America. And so I think, as Alison said, the challenge of using this, putting this research into practice, I think is going to be really difficult. I think a lot of our messages are built into our DNA, and trying to challenge that, I think, is hard. And I think the other thing that we've found difficult, because there's a few different players in New Zealand who are running their own little yes campaigns, and the frustration that you feel when you think you're doing the right thing and you've got all the best messages and you know what works for the undecided voter, and then you see all of your allies using messages that don't work, or messages that trigger the no voters and so on. It's it's hard. Look, I lose lots of hair over this. But look. So I think for us, the research is really important. Once the cannabis campaign is out of the way and we've won the referendum, the next thing we need to do as a country in New Zealand is to do that wider drug law reform. How do we shift our system into one that's really focused on health? And I think that the research Mark's done is going to be absolutely invaluable. I think, yes, you're Australian, we're Kiwis, but I think there's a lot of similarities to how we view these issues. So we're committed to using this research, trying to put that into practice. And I'm also really committed to use the research that we've done, the messages that we've tested, and to remind myself at every opportunity to use those messages and not fall, back to what we used to. But look, that's me for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. Sione, I'll just ask you to perhaps reflect on the research and what it might mean for your work.
Sure, thank you. So really, when I first spoke to Mark and heard about the work and attended the first sort of information session around this, it resonated really quite strongly with me. And one of the reasons for that is that you know, Harm Reduction Victoria is a peer organisation. I think, like all of us, we are in this because we're values led. Our organisation is values led, and often I think, certainly in my working life and in my personal life, I've been led by those values very strongly. And so, as the others has already spoken about, it can be challenging to then reflect on whether or not the very things you've been talking about for many years are right. But it resonated strongly because instinctively I understood that that I had always felt uncomfortable with a lot of the messaging that had been common in harm reduction, and even the framing of our organisation as Harm Reduction Victoria. We had a very good reason for making that decision, I believe. But personally, I would like to get away from talking from sort of front-ending harm so often when we talk about this. Harm reduction was a great term when it was first coined many decades ago, but certainly it front ends the exact thing that we're talking about, I think. And so with that, that's challenging just you know, just in our organisation, and I think that that's one of the things that I've found really already very useful about this work, is being able to think not just about our messaging. We do messaging to a range of stakeholders, you know, our peers, our community, to the sector, to government, you know, to persuadables and to opponents in the media sometimes as well. But also it helps me think about our organisation. It helps me think about why and how we operate the way that we do, and think about maybe different frameworks for thinking about how we do that moving forwards. And that's one of the key benefits, I think, for us in this work. Interestingly, we've just come off the back of International Overdose Awareness Day, which is an incredible achievement in terms of the amount of buy-in and engagement we've had with that. But just like harm reduction, and as a term, and just like a lot of the messaging that we've talked about, I've always personally felt relatively uncomfortable with overdose being one of the big ways that people communicate and understand our drug use. It's a very negative approach, and I think that, to be fair, over time the Awareness Day has changed the way that it talks about things, and definitely talks much more about stigma and about support and all those sort of things, which is great. But nevertheless, still one of the biggest days of the year is based around a serious issue, and the epidemic type framing is very difficult to get away from with that as well. So I think that you know, not only is this issues a challenge to us organisationally and personally and sector-wide, but it also, one of those challenges is thinking about the things that we have achieved. You know, when I first started in this work, no one talked about stigma very much, and we are, you know, it's way more common to talk about stigma around drug use now than it was 20 years ago anyway, which is great. But how do we use this work to actually build on the stuff that we've done now, and talk to things like and talk about things like the International Overdose Awareness Day, which is a great thing that we don't want to sort of throw away, but how do we transition our own work and the work of our entire sector to think along these lines as well. So it's a big piece of work, but it's really exciting.
Thanks, Yoni. I'm hearing common issues come up here, which is partly how do we start to shift our own behaviour so that we can shift the behaviour of others. Emma, can I just ask you to reflect before I move to questions?
Yeah, thanks, Erin. So one of the benefits of being kind of on the reference group that was seeing this work is the opportunity to kind of get our hands on it as it was emerging and begin to implement it. So for the Fair Treatment campaign, we have begun to try and use the guide, and so we have, you know, changed a lot of the messaging on our website. We've looked at our internal documents in terms of, our internal aims of the campaign and the way we talk about the campaign. And we've also begun the process of reviewing the kind of collateral we have for the campaign that we might take to meetings with MPs or fact sheets we have to try and reflect it. And initially, and I found it really quite tricky to, I loved the sample statement so much that I couldn't kind of work out how to make it our own and adapt it to our circumstances. And so, but Mark was very helpful with that. But it has become easier, I think, the more you do it. So I just wanted to kind of say this is just one of those things where, we don't need to be perfect, at the beginning. Of course, we're always striving to do better, but it is going to be a constant and ongoing process. And even just Alison and others raising those issues about overdose awareness day and naloxone has raised some red flags with me about stuff that we've just done in this last week. And I think we just need to make sure that we also have this open and honest conversation about the way we're talking about people who use drugs and drug dependency, so that we can all be constantly improving our practice in relation to messaging. So some of the things that we really had to stop doing was we were really into the negation. So I think we're on top of that, and we're always saying it needs to be treated as a health, not a criminal issue. We also need to stop talking about dying. That was a big one for us, and jail. We also had this, and I'll give an example of that in a minute, how we reframed a message, but facts were a bit of we were doing these fact sheets to take to meetings with MPs that, were focused on the health, links with the health system, links with the criminal justice system. And so it did take, particularly with members of the team, to kind of say, well, look, we're leading with our values, and they're like, oh no, but these are people that want facts. And I said, yeah, look, we have to give them the facts, but we have to understand that it's the initial value statement that is really what's going to persuade them. They might think they're being persuaded by the facts, so they need to be there. And when they go and repeat our message to others, it'll give them confidence to do it because they know they've got the facts. And so beginning to think about facts in that way was interesting too. So we used to say on our website, we all want to live in a world where no one dies from drug use and where treatment is available for all who seek it. And this is what we changed it to. And this is not perfect, not endorsed by Mark. This is our best foot forward, and we can change it tomorrow. But we all want to live in a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, including people who use drugs, where we have drug laws informed by best practice and evidence, and where treatment is available for all who seek it. So, great. So, but look, we do have more work to do, obviously, and as I said, it's going to always be an evolving and ongoing process. I don't think we're talking enough about the diversity of people who use drugs. I still think we're not framing stigma enough as a problem that we're trying to deal with and combat. And I think the issue that Ross raised in terms of in terms of how you incorporate the messaging in the more dynamic communication issue, like when you're in an interview or whatever, I think, and I don't know whether people are wanting to draw a line completely under this research and move on, but I think almost the next phase might need to be about that. How do we have, and we've done some work on this internally too, about how do we have those difficult conversations, how when people want to drag you into the negative and people want to drag you into fear, how do you use this messaging guide to climb out of that and to redirect? And maybe that might be the kind of next phase of our work together. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Emma. It's great to hear firsthand of how you've been able to use this work. And I know you've talked with us and others about sort of that process of change for you, which is a really helpful experience for us to hear from, particularly given we know how hard it is to change behaviour. Just going to move through the questions, and they're not directed to anyone, although Mark, I suspect that you may be best placed to answer many of them, but please, other panel members, feel free to chip in. The first one, and you can see them as well, is personalising the issue helpful or unhelpful? E.g., imagine your child was using, what would you want if it was you, etc.
Great question. I would say yes, it is helpful, but the frame is different to whether we're talking about real people or talking in the abstract about general people. So we still, if you are talking about sort of, imagine it was your daughter or your brother, I think it's important to do that in a way that we're saying, how would you want your brother treated if they were using drugs, or if they were experiencing dependence on drugs, or how would you want your daughter treated, or how would you, So we're focusing on the treatment of those people as opposed to how would you, how would you want society to respond if your brother was a drug addict? Because then we're just using all the old frames, and that might just evoke fear because people think, well, I don't want that to happen, so can we just do everything we can to make it as illegal as possible? So just making sure that we are actually telling the new story, but absolutely, the more we personalise, the more we make it real for people and human for people, and we engage their sense of empathy, the better it'll be. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Mark. The next one's from Karen. I've done a lot of research on public opinion about sentencing and the malleability and durability of attitudes. I found that people's attitudes can be shifted, but that shifts tend not to last. Do you think there's a similar issue here, that the persuadables can be shifted, but that these shifts may not be sustained?
Another great question. So, yes, so in terms of the way in which messaging impacts on people is that it is if we're talking about openness and honesty and framing the issue really well, that will have a temporary effect on people because they will be thinking about the issue from that different and better perspective. But then a week later, 2 months later, when someone talks about the issue again, it might not be the dominant frame that they then default back to. They might go back to the old way of thinking about the issue. And that is why it is important that we have 100+ people on the call today, because the more that we are consistently telling this story repetitively, the stronger that story will become, and the more likely that it becomes the dominant frame through which people think about it. Because literally what's happening is every time you're communicating with people, you are forcing their brain synapses to establish new connections. So their neurons are literally firing together and wiring together. And the more that we do that, the stronger those neural connections become, and the more likely it is that that will be the neural pathway through which drugs will be interpreted in the future. So if we want to create those really strong neural connections in people's brains, they need to hear the message more than once and from as many people as possible. Yeah, repetition is key.
Thanks, Mark. That might be why Emma's experience was it got easier as she did it over time too, something we can all take away from it. The next question is from Nick, who's wondering a few things, whether there is a breakdown on different attitudes if the term drug is disambiguated, and whether that's something that matters or perhaps causes unnecessary divisions, and whether or not the use of the term drugs is unhelpful, especially considering it's a powerful, unclear term and feeds many of the problems.
I might say something short and then see if others want to contribute to this, but we made the choice early in the research that this was one of the things that was incredibly interesting but impossible for us to explore with enough detail, right? So we don't really have any evidence base behind this, but I do think it is a really important and interesting question. And my gut and based on what we've seen in the research is that yes, just saying drugs isn't necessarily helpful, because it classes all these different substances together, some of which will irk people more than others and therefore evoke negative associations. It is much better to talk about specific substances and the specific effects and get granular, because that sort of divorces it away from these emotive terms that we've learnt to be fearful of. But yeah, I'd be fascinated to hear what the other panel members think.
From Alison here, in the reverse, it's actually very advantageous to talk about drugs because you're not making some of them good and some of them bad. So, you know, the problem with some policy responses is that they'll be okay for ecstasy and cannabis, but it wouldn't be okay for crystal. And that's certainly not a position that I support. And so I think what's useful about the term drugs is that it is blurry and unclear and doesn't start an argument about, well, cannabis is okay, but heroin's not. Ecstasy's okay, but methamphetamine's not. And we know that people are quite split on their opinions in the general population about these different substances. And we know that people who use drugs also have very negative attitudes to drugs that they don't use. And it's exactly that creates stigma, actually. So I would argue that the term drugs is helpful unless you're arguing for a specific law reform, cannabis law reform in New Zealand, Ross, for example. You don't want to conflate cannabis with, you know, heroin or whatever.
I also just wanted to add the issue about a lot of the framing being alcohol and other drugs, and the outcome of the research that showed that even if, like, for example, the Fair Treatment campaign isn't really about alcohol use, but when you talk about them both together, it works in terms of bringing more persuadables with you. And I'm sure Mark can talk about that in more detail, but that, I think, is an example of a little bit more specificity around, you know, adds to the, if you're not just using drugs on its own, it works better.
Yes, it's one of the reasons that we changed the name of the Australian Drug Foundation to the Alcohol and Drug Foundation. Ross, what's been your experience, as per Alison's comment, around cannabis drug law reform in New Zealand, and your thoughts on this particular question in that context?
It's complicated. Because we're dealing with quite a specific thing that all New Zealanders are having to think about. Lots of different things come up. So, you know, our opposition, for example, will say that if we legalise cannabis, it's the slippery slope. Next, they want to legalise meth. And then there are, you know, the challenge of there are substances, for whatever reason, usually because of, as a society, we've created them as such, come with their inbuilt fear. And, you know, so crystal meth or meth, I think, is one of those ones that as soon as people hear that word, it just freaks them out. So I don't know. I think it's been quite useful to only talk about cannabis at the moment in New Zealand, narrow it right down. We have a specific piece of law we're talking about. All the peripheral stuff you can kind of ignore. The extent to which you can exploit some of these distinctions, I think, is, you know, without being too cynical. We had in New Zealand a few years ago people dying from using synthetic cannabinoids. And a lot of the debate, it wasn't an argument that we were pushing, but a lot of the debate in the public mind was, well, if we legalized natural cannabis, then we could avoid, you know, the synthetic stuff that's really poisonous. And that got some traction. And whether you can, you know, some people, again, not us, but some people make the argument that if you had legal, you know, people buy cannabis from places where they will also sell meth. So if you legalize cannabis, you can break that chain between, you know, people coming into contact with meth. But again, none of those messages test well. They're not messages that we use, but they're intuitively things that you'll see some media commentators use and others use. I don't know. The whole thing's really messy and hard.
Thanks, Ross.
And it's messy. Partly, I agree, Ross. It's really messy, and you're talking about something a little bit different. But from the perspective of a peer organisation, we've sort of worked really hard over time to try and spread our work across a range of people who use drugs, because ultimately we were first funded really primarily to do HIV type prevention. So you sort of end up going down an injecting drug use path. But ultimately, the community is really messy and broad, and people don't usually use just one type of drug or one kind of type of ingestion. And so the more, definitely from our perspective, the more we can talk about it more broadly, the better. But also, you're right, every now and then you have to focus in on an issue, because an issue around injecting drug use is often different to smoking cannabis.
Yeah, and I think ultimately we should be able to ignore the use of the word, not use either the substances themselves or even the word drug. Because if you look at what Mark's saying and what the research supports, you're wanting to be talking about healthy and safe communities and supporting people. And so in all of that sort of narrative, you're not talking about the thing. You're talking about the end point or the vision that you want. And again, trying to remind yourself to use that language, I think, is always hard. But we're talking about an end state, something that we can all aspire to. And in those conversations, you don't need to mention meth or whatever.
There is a related question, Mark, which asked whether you've looked into public opinion regarding specific types of substances and whether there was different messaging required for different substances. And I know we talked about this while we were doing the work, but perhaps if you or other members of the group would like to comment on our discussions as we considered that.
Yeah, only to say that, as my previous answer, no, we didn't explore it, but we thought about it, because we know that it could be interesting to explore whether different types of messaging works on different types of substances or methods of delivery, all of these different questions, or sort of purpose of use, those sort of things. But in the end, just because it's a single project, we couldn't explore them in the way that they deserve to be explored. But I will say that we did look at attitudes, sort of, not what persuades people, but different attitudes of different drugs. And what we found amongst those supporters versus opponents, for example, is supporters, which is interesting, supporters were significantly more likely to think of alcohol as the most dangerous or harmful drug in Australia. Opposition was the least likely to think that alcohol was the most harmful drug in Australia. So there are some interesting differences there in terms of the nuance and in some ways, the more factual way of thinking about drugs and the differences between them, which then seems to influence people's likelihood to just carry across a whole of population stigma against anyone who uses drugs that are technically classified as illegal. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. There's lots of comments in the chat bar too, if people are wanting to just read through them. I'm just jumping to some of the questions. Amanda's asked, a common argument in Australia and worldwide is that $1 spent on prevention saves dollars in treatment. Is this useful or counterproductive?
This is one of the ones that we didn't test because we had strong leads from other research that it would not work. What happens when we use these sort of monetary or economic rationales for issues that are at heart about more sort of social health or social justice perspectives or values, is that we actually weaken people's concern about the person who's using drugs, for example, or the person who's being criminalised for the use of drugs. And what we do is we actually open up a whole bunch of can of worms around, well, if treatment or if throwing someone in jail costs this much money, then why don't we make it even more, create harsher penalties, so we disincentivize people even more? All sorts of solutions that we do not support become more attractive to people, because in the end, as Emma pointed out really well before, it isn't about facts. It is entirely about the emotion and the story. And if we just say that it costs a lot of money to deal with people who use drugs, we're not actually changing the story one single bit. And all we're doing is making people feel even more angry about the economic impact of these people who they already have negative feelings towards.
Yep, Ross?
Oh, it's completely unrelated to the question around cost and benefit.
Then you can't talk.
No, well, I'll make an observation around, because there's some things, because that message around every $1 you save this, there's lots of things, again, the messages that we all fall back to. And maybe this is a question for Mark, or just a general observation. But the issue, with cannabis, but I think also for other issues around wider drug law reform and criminal justice reform. You know, our base supporters are rightly outraged that our criminal justice system and our drug law is racist and impacts more on Māori. You know, 3 times more likely to get convicted, 7 times more likely to get a prison sentence. And so for a while, and we should all, you know, as social justice people, you know, that's troubling, and we need to do something about that. Our experience when we started using issues around the race-based inequities in our drug law, we even brought over some fantastic women from America from the Black Lives Matter movement, because we wanted to situate, you know, the cannabis issue in the wider criminal justice reform issue and how racist our drug law is. Well, can I tell you from experience that is a really, you know, that you don't win over persuadables, and you just rile everyone up. When I say everyone, I mean all the racists in the country. And so this is another troubling thing for me, is that, you know, our values around social justice would compel us to raise these issues and talk about these issues. But you are, you know, in some cases, and I think that's one example of where you are just coming against, you know, some really big, messy stuff. Anyway, I don't, Mark, if you have any tips around that issue.
Just to say that what works for our supporters and what really gets them going sometimes is not the stuff that works for persuadable audiences, and the problem is that we're supporters, so sometimes, and we're talking to supporters all the time, we're talking to each other, and so we make assumptions about the stuff that really gets us emotionally going and makes sense to us. Surely that will get other people across the line, and it's often not the case. And I think you're right. What you've done there is you've just opened up a whole other can of worms of complex stigma and so on, and discrimination that's going on, and prejudice, and maybe that's not the best way of tackling something that's already so complicated and so emotional. Yeah. Not saying that you couldn't go down that track, but you would have to do it very, very carefully. I would definitely be message testing.
Thanks, Mark. This relates a little bit to Sione's opening remarks, and is the term harm reduction, it's unhelpful itself, and wondering if these kinds of messages could work as well with self-stigma. So a couple of questions wrapped up there.
I think the problem with harm reduction is that if you talk about harm reduction, it depends on the context you put it in. But as a phrase, and the way it's often used in the discourse from the discourse I looked at for this project, it often implies that it's about reducing the harms that the substance causes to people who use it. And what it does is it ignores all the social and the legal and all the other elements that contribute to the harm that comes to people who use drugs. And so it actually isn't telling a new story at all. It's just saying that drugs are harmful and we want to reduce those harms. And that doesn't necessarily change the story. But if you are talking about the fact that what we should be focusing on is making sure that people who use drugs are safe and healthy and get the support they need if they need it, then that is a different sort of thing. So we can still talk about harm reduction, but probably not just, let's not rely on the jargon and assume that people will interpret that the way we interpret it.
One of the issues is that it's very, as you point out, it's very much changed over time, and depending on your angle of looking at the issue, people use those terms completely differently, and so you often, as we've talked about, you're often speaking in different. You're giving unintentional signals often, you know, and one of the commonest questions that we sort of get as harm reductionists is, you know, from opponents is around, you know, all the other harms that they see flowing from drug use. They think we should be trying to address that, and so we often will have to fall back on talking about the original purpose of what harm reduction is, and it's just, yeah, it feels like it's a bit more of a hassle than it's worth at the moment, to be really honest. That term, I mean, but ultimately we have transitioned to talking more about the broader the broader harms that come from the war on drugs and blah, 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 which is all really important. But ultimately, as a community and a peer organisation, we fall back on care for the community and care for ourselves, and I think that's what a lot of us see harm reduction as now, more than just stopping HIV and Hep C.
I can see a whole lot of deep conversations occurring after this particular session, which is exactly what it was designed to do. There's a question here, Mark and others, about talking about the risks associated with drug use, but avoiding scaring people at the same time. How might we approach that?
So I do have a thought on that, because this is one of the first things that Carmel from the Alcohol and Drug Foundation sort of asked me when she saw the guide was, well, we talk about risks, how do we do that without sort of violating rule number 1 around scaring people? And I think there's a couple of ways that you can do that. One is to, in the process of talking about the risks, remind people that not everyone who uses drugs suffers serious harm as a result of their use. So, you know, many people use drugs and lead otherwise normal lives and do not require support or treatment. But for those who do, this is what we should do. Or another thing is to point out that, as with any drug, whether they're over the counter, they're legal or illegal, they carry risks. And the more information we have about the drugs and the more support people have to stay healthy and safe, the better. This is why we need an open, honest approach to drugs, and to ensure that we're treating it as a health issue where people can access support and treatment if they need it, rather than feel fear or stigma about being open about their use of drugs or something. You know, along those lines, sort of it helps us actually weave a story into that. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. It does. No, it was good. Thoughts from others? All in agreement?
I wonder if I could just make a few general comments quickly. One is that to remind us all that we're not dealing with a homogeneous target audience. We're dealing with a very diverse target audience, and arguments that will work with Lachlan Murdoch but won't work with necessarily with Anthony Albanese. It's the leader of the opposition, Ross, in Australia. We've got to recognise that. Secondly, I think it's fair comment to say that the efforts to achieve drug law reform in Australia and in other countries haven't been as successful as we'd liked. But I think we have to recognise that they have had a lot of success. These efforts started 40 years ago or so, and we were faced during that time with a fearsome HIV epidemic, which threatened to sweep through people who inject drugs and go on to become generalised epidemics. And in most countries, that was avoided through the implementation of what we call harm reduction package. And let's not forget that was against overwhelming odds. In those days, as Ross would know, support for regulating cannabis was unmeasurably low. In 1969, the Gallup poll in the United States, 12% of people in the US responding to that poll supported the legalisation of marijuana, as they called it there. And now that percentage is over 60. In Australia, for the first time in 2019, there were more people supporting the legalisation of cannabis, 41%, than opposed to it, 37%. So I could go on that vein, but social reform is always slow, always takes a long time. Look at homosexual law reform, how many decades that took. And this is the same kind of issue, more or less.
Thanks,
so
Alex.
I think let's remember diversity. Let's be optimistic.
Thank you, Alex. I think the diversity issue is certainly one that's come up a few times here. And just going to your first point that you made, one of the questions that we have here is, and Mark, it might be interesting to hear from you, is how can we identify whether someone I speak to is a persuadable or unconvincingly opposed? The Lachlans or the Anthonys?
Okay, so That's a good question. So the way in which what characterises a supporter versus an opposition versus a persuadable, actually, supporters and opposition are very similar. They're actually entirely bought in to one argument or another, right? That we have our story just as firmly entrenched in our being as the opposition has their story entrenched in their being. And persuadables are different to us in that they are more flexible in their thinking. And you remember that sort of the duck rabbit I showed you at the beginning. As supporters, we see the rabbit, perhaps, and we really struggle to see the duck. And the opposition is just the opposite. They see the duck and you try and tell them there's a rabbit there and they just ignore you. Whereas what the persuadables are doing is they're looking at that and they're seeing the duck when we point to the duck, and they're seeing the rabbit when we help them see the rabbit. And so the way in which you identify the difference between a persuadable person and an opposition, they might say the exact same thing as an initial argument. But as you then reframe the issue from your perspective, what you'll notice a persuadable person do is they will actually start to have a conversation with you about it. Whereas what an opposition person will do is they will just go to any facts and figures and they'll keep changing their arguments every 2 minutes. Every time you show them facts that show that what they've just said is wrong, they'll switch to a different set of facts. They'll just switch to a different set of arguments. And that is the way to really tell, is the person, well, it seems like a really simplistic answer in the end, but it's really, is the person open to being persuaded? Are you getting that sense, or are they just constantly finding new ways of rebutting what you're trying to tell them? Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. I've got someone sharing their screen. I'm not sure who it is. I think it's Roderick. If you could just unshare your screen so that we can see people, that would be great. Thank you. There's an interesting question here, which I think goes a little to Alex's comment on the fact that this environment in which we're having conversations is constantly changing. And it's about, what do you think about the psychedelic related narratives such as medicine enhancing cognitive capacity, Silicon Valley, etc. This is a new drug narrative. We always worry about promoting drug use, but is that literally what we should be doing, highlighting the benefits?
I feel like these are proof points that we should have a more nuanced approach to drugs, rather than thinking of it as an actual new narrative. And so I think you could talk about these innovations and these potential benefits from within the openness and honesty frame. So you can say we need to have a more open and honest conversation about drugs. We need to stop sticking our heads in the sand, because there are things that we are missing out on as a result of that. And so we should be exploring this. We should be open to understanding better what's going on, and not treating, not just saying no because it's drugs or whatever. So yeah, I don't think that it is a new narrative. I just think it's another way of selling the benefits and creating a more nuanced picture, but it needs to be within another story.
Do you think, can I jump in there, Erin? Do you think, Mark, you could phrase it, you could put it with that when you have the point about, there are people from mechanics to hairdressers or whatever who use drugs and otherwise lead normal lives, and there's emerging evidence about the, what is it, I don't want to say health benefits, but, the benefits of these drugs as part of our regular treatment regimes or whatever, right? Let's not never use the word regime, but you know what I mean. Like, could you link it in to that?
I think so. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I worry enormously about the conflation of medicine with recreational drug use, actually, and it's probably an unpopular view, but I don't regard medicinal cannabis as having anything to do with drug policy. That's about the availability of a medication for certain conditions. And even as the editor of a journal, I'm tempted not to accept papers that are concerned with medicinal cannabis. They should be going to medical journals, quite frankly. But I know that that's not an uncommon view, and I actually have a very similar view about psychedelics and the use of MDMA to treat post-traumatic stress disorder and so on. Maybe I need to think about it some more, but I'm uncomfortable conflating medical treatments with recreational drug use. I mean, I think it's strategic on occasion and the whole Trojan horse argument, but I actually don't think they sit together comfortably for me as an advocate for drug policy reform.
There is a question specifically about medical cannabis as well, asking.
Yes, I saw both the psychedelics.
Yeah.
Or both of them. Yeah.
I think what talking about it does is it disrupts the narrative that drugs that are illegal are necessarily harmful and bad. Drugs that are legal are totally fine, and therapeutic perhaps if they are sort of prescription drugs and so on. And so it's useful from that perspective of disrupting the narrative. But I think you've got a really good point there, Alison, in terms of if people can categorise the drug into their medical side of things, it doesn't actually change the story about recreational use of drugs, for example, or self-medication. So yeah, we can't, that's what I meant by, I don't think it is a new narrative necessarily. It's just a proof point we can use that has to be embedded within a narrative.
Thanks, Mark and Alison. I'm conscious of the time. We have 3 minutes left and there's lots of commentary that I haven't managed to get to in the chat bar. So please, I urge you to go in there and have a look at it. Just to summarise, look, thank you to Mark and the panel. It's been great to get your insights, and I think overwhelmingly we've all recognised that this will only change if we change it. As Alex has pointed out, change is slow but happening. We can promote it and make it happen more quickly if we start to work with the persuadables. We will be distributing to everyone who's come to this the message guide that Mark's developed, and you'll see that he's really only covered a sort of the tip of the iceberg in his presentation. There's a lot more really great information in the message guide. I think because of the challenges in changing behaviour, it would be great to continue the conversation. Emma, your examples of how you've started to adopt the new language, I think are really great for us to learn from, and to hear how others are using it and changing the language that they use would be helpful. So I will certainly be in touch with people around what the next steps might look like as we try and promote this going forward, because it will be one of our greatest challenges, which is why this workshop was so important. So thank you all for coming and giving us your time and questions and thoughts. I'll close off, but just before I do, I just wanted to acknowledge Ross. I'm not sure if people know that Ross is leaving the New Zealand Drug Foundation. We are all devastated by that news. Ross, this might be the last time we see you in your current role. And from our Australian colleagues, I just wanted to extend best wishes and thanks, and Dan, you for leading us, but thanks for all of the work you've done over the last 16 years in your role in New Zealand. It's been a terrific contribution. So thanks everyone. I'll let you all go and enjoy lunch and a cup of coffee, and thanks to you all for coming.